Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see everyone here today. Yeah, the Rabbi, Emily, Rachel, Yuri, and everyone else that is joining us. We're grateful to have you around. We'll just like to start now at 3 p.m. With Yuri's performance. But before the performance, we'll just start with some other persons will join us as the event continues. Please let's mute our mics so that we don't distract during the course of the event. So today's Author Spotlight event is one of the series of programs that we hold at the West African Transitional Justice Center. Just a brief introduction of the center. The West African Transitional Justice Center is an initiative within the West African context where we try to mediate between the practice and research of transitional justice within the sub-region in West Africa and, of course, on the continent of Africa generally. What we noticed was that there was a gap, in terms of the kind of interventions that practitioners were carrying out within the sub-region, which were not as evidence-driven as they ought to be. And so we decided to bring together a committee of practice for academics and practitioners where they can exchange, ideas. And this, one of the reasons is also to put these interventions within the framework of global scholarship. And that's why we invite scholars, renowned scholars from everywhere. And we're glad to have the quality of people we have on today's event. Rabbi Frank Smith, Dr. Fila, Rachel, and it's so exciting. And also to have a free performance by Yuri, who has to rush off to work. Yeah. So I think we'll just start. Just to mention that we record this event so that you can put it on our website as a resource for people who still want to access some products of the discussion afterwards. So the event is being recorded. So we'll start with the big box performance by Yuri, if he's ready for us, because he has to rush off to work ahead. Yeah. So.
Joshua! Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Down. Shalom. Salam. Peace. Let's all get together. Let's all get together. The raisin came tumbling down. The raisin came tumbling down, down, down. Chicago's in the house. And the walls came tumbling. Peace.
Wow, 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 wow.
Take a bow.
This is so lovely. Thanks, Yuri. Thanks, Yuri. This is
All
great.
right, have a great talk. Peace.
Yeah, yeah. Just a brief introduction to of the author of today's Author Spotlight event. I think the only introduction that I can make is to say that I shared one of my most memorable moments with Rachel while we sailed on the Mississippi together, you know, in Minnesota where we met, and it was quite interesting to also learn about our work. I think I got a gift from her in 2017 as well. The work on River Jordan, which I think it's, you know, a very important representation of the importance of the river when you talk about the Middle Eastern, you know, crisis and its management and its historical symbolism and stuff like that. So we thank Yuri for that wonderful performance again. And so we'll just move on. So I'll hand over the platform to Professor Havelock. You know, perhaps she wants to make a little introduction of herself and the work to us, and we'll continue for that. So after Professor Havelock, Dr. Fila will give us, I mean, she wrote a very beautiful review online. If you want to have a look at it, it's there. So it's good to listen to her in person. And of course, the rabbi would also make his own intervention, of course. So it's going to be a very interesting encounter. And so I welcome us to just be attentive and make it as interactive as possible. So Professor Havelock, please. Yeah.
Yes, I want to thank you, Philip, so much for convening us here this morning and everyone for joining. I'm glad some people came late because it's very difficult for me to follow Yuri and be anywhere near as entertaining and lively. And yes, really want to thank both Rabbi Frank and Dr. Emily for being here this morning and for the great attention. So I'm going to be speaking today about a book that I wrote that came out last year. I'll show some slides to describe the argument. But before we get into this slideshow and this interactive discussion, in light of what the center's doing, I thought I might just, begin with a little bit of an introduction to some of the questions that drove me to write this book, because many decades of research in Israel and Palestine, of course, led me, right into the center of a pretty intense scenario of militarization and surveillance and alienation among different population groups. And of course, right, the most famous and the most compelling in terms of reconciliation is between Israelis and Palestinians, but the fractures run in many directions, right? Among very religious communities, among both Israelis and Palestinians versus more secular groups, various stripes of the right wing versus each other, not to mention a kind of centrist position, not to mention fractures within left-wing movements and then between left and right. So with all of this fracture and all of this kind of dissipation among groups in a scenario of surveillance and militarism, I wanted to kind of pursue the impacts that this has on culture, and then how these cultural formations in turn, influence that kind of fractured and militarized society. And the other piece, right, I'm not a sociologist, right? I'm a scholar of texts and also geography, but I wanted to also really get into how interpretation of these kind of central narratives plays a role. And so this led me to pursue one form of public political interpretation that I think played a very central role in how the Israeli occupation developed and how it continues to manifest. But I just didn't want to leave it there. I wanted to open up some space for alternate or counter interpretations, and also to show how some of these texts that work as founding documents for nationalism, for militarization, for institutions like the army, right? How these same narratives contain possibilities within them for other social formations, other kind of relationships with other communities, as well as with the land and the space and the water itself. So those are the two big things. What are the cultural reflexes of this kind of very intense occupation, right? How does culture relate to nationalism and to experiences of geography? And then I wanted to just open up, how do we get out of this? What are the way forward? So with that, I'm going to share my screen and take you through. Let me get screen view. What I call the Joshua generation, Israeli occupation, and the Bible. Okay. So the book of Joshua is and we're going to start here. I don't think I quite said this. We're going to start here with the Hebrew Bible, where this kind of central military text can be found. So, okay, we're going to talk about Jewish war. And one thing to say about Jewish war is that there aren't very many of them, but when this kind of war manifests, it has a trans-historical nature, and it always occurs in the same geography, right? Roughly between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And there's three manifestations of this. One is, what we should kind of call the fictional conquest in the book of Joshua, where under the leadership of the successor of the prophet Moses, and this is the text in the Bible, the wandering tribes of Israel cross the Jordan River and begin a concerted campaign against the resident Canaanites. And the first half of the book of Joshua sort of celebrates the complete extermination of all of the Canaanites. It's important to say at the outset, in case we run out of time, that if you keep reading in the book of Joshua, the fiction of this kind of extermination is exposed because the very peoples who are allegedly wiped out in the first half of the book of Joshua are all still there in the second half of the book of Joshua. But that's a narrative. It's a very disturbing narrative that has served as a supporting text for many instances of colonization, as well as many instances of settler colonialism, as we see in the case of Israel. And so the book of Joshua wasn't much read. It didn't really serve as a template until right about the years, the 160s before the Common Era, when the Greek Empire colonized ancient Palestine, and there was a guerrilla uprising against it by these folks, the Maccabees, who were guerrilla warriors who became a dynasty. And that was a moment where we see again a lot of reading and interpretation of the book of Joshua. What really stands out is that Jewish history is fairly long, and most of it takes place in the diaspora, in many different countries, communities, many different iterations. And something that has to be said about this warring martial book of Joshua is that it isn't much read in the diaspora, right? There's all kinds of stories of even rabbis like gluing or stapling the book of Joshua shut because this kind of militarism is not characteristic, was in fact rejected by most of diasporic Judaism. But with the rise of the Zionist movement, with the idea that diasporic Jews would return to this ancient homeland and establish some kind of political sovereignty there, we see the rise of reading in the book of Joshua to serve as kind of a guidebook and a template for what this form of sovereignty might be. And I think in a certain way, this is where the trouble begins. Okay, so just as I said, with the birth of the Zionist movement, this book is read, place names, early settlements, boundary sites are all names taken from the book of Joshua. And just a way to kind of show how much this biblical text influences Israeli culture, this is a mural. It's a mosaic. It also serves as the image on the cover of my book. And this is at the side of a building in northern Tel Aviv. And there's also a grocery store there. It's was commissioned in the 1960s. You can see nobody's really maintaining this mosaic. But, what we can see here, I think, illustrates very well how the book of Joshua gave the young state of Israel a paradigm for thinking about its relationship to resident Palestinians. Because here we see in the mosaic the depiction of Joshua's army bravely going forward with bows and arrows and spears. And here they are, facing off against opponents. In the Bible, these are the Canaanites, but we see them supine, surrendering, weak, lying before the army. And again, this is a mosaic that was commissioned in the early 1960s. And I think it serves as a kind of figuration for how the Israelis used this biblical image to imagine the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. And okay, so why read the book of Joshua? Well, because the aim was to sort of do a modern day embodiment of these conquerors, right? Of these masculine warriors, and to use this biblical image as the template to restore Joshua's army. And this is a very key picture. This figure right here in the center, who is not saluting, this is David Ben-Gurion, the very first prime minister of Israel, largely looked upon as the father of Israel. And it was Ben-Gurion himself who was so obsessed with this book of Joshua and really led the way for it to play this central role. Right next to him is an archaeologist, as well as the chief of staff of the first Israel Defense Forces. That's Yigael Yadin. Okay, went ahead one. Okay. So what happened? Well, Israel's founding war in 1948 was narrated in real time by figures like Ben-Gurion and Yigael Yadin. It was narrated in real time as being this modern installation, right? This modern instance of the book of Joshua. And, I'll give you kind of a personal aside. I did grow up in the United States, but I went to a school that followed the curriculum in Israel, where your first exposure as a young person to the book of Joshua is in the 4th grade. And so, like Israeli students, I spent my whole 4th grade year immersed in this book, and we had a very large map that was at the center of the room. And even in the way I was taught this book, I was always a little confused about whether the battle had happened in ancient times or whether it was 1948. I mean, the degree to which, this ancient war really set the narrative for narrating the 1948 war, it can't really be overstated. But here's one thing that's interesting. Although the war was narrated and celebrated in the language of Joshua, this fusion of conquest and Israeli culture did not really occur until about 10 years later. So why is that? The big war was 1948, the moment where the book of Joshua really made its inroads into Israeli culture was in 1958. And, really the reason for that is that first 10 years of statehood after the war was concluded was really focused on absorbing Jews from all over the world. So by 1958, although with a lot of upset and a lot of trauma, by 1958, Jews indeed from the corners of the earth had been absorbed into Israel. And, we have to really note that it was a massive absorption process, but it also really created a class stratified society. And those class stratifications were largely based on the race of Jews from all over the world. There's a lot to say about that, but white Western Jews were kind of automatically placed at the higher end of that class stratification, and Jews from Middle Eastern or Eastern countries, were automatically figured at the bottom of that. So, it's 1958. Ben-Gurion is still prime minister. He is celebrating 10 years of the state, and he's looking around at a fairly fragmented country of Jews with some Palestinian citizens, but many more in this kind of hazy zone of having citizenship or being denied citizenship. And Ben-Gurion wanted a narrative. He wanted a narrative to unify this disparate population, and he wanted a narrative in which no matter when a Jewish person had come to the state of Israel, that they could recognize themselves in that founding war. And so in 1958, Ben-Gurion convened the kind of leading figures of the young state, and they sat at the prime minister's house twice a month, and they narrated this central narrative of the state of Israel entirely in the language of Joshua. And so what's the upshot of that? Well, the upshot of that is that this relationship toward Palestinian residents or even non-citizens and even citizens in the state was automatically organized in this kind of conqueror-conquered paradigm. And right, the kind of central way to embody one's Israeliness was by serving in the army and being part of this narrative complex. In the interest of time, I'm going to take you, past this central rivalry of two archaeologists there right now, just to make another point. Well, hang on, let me make this point, and then I'll end with the possibilities in the biblical text. So, Ben-Gurion wanted this kind of unity through the army, through the Hebrew language, through this narrative of political sovereignty and military prowess. And Ben-Gurion's narrative was maybe successful for about 9 years. For about 9 years, this sense of Israelis as being nationalistic, Hebrew speakers, right, part of a cohesive state, it lasted until the next major war in 1967, when this fellow with the eye patch, Moshe Dayan, declared himself the Joshua for a new era, conquered the West Bank up until the Jordan River. And, the whole sort of question of what to do about occupied territories with Palestinian residents, what the relationship of the occupation would be to the state, really causes those internal rifts in the society to open into chasms. But the other upshot of this Joshua narrative being so central in the state of Israel is that generation after generation of political leaders sort of want to up the ante and be more Joshua-like than Ben-Gurion, right? More of a conqueror than Moshe Dayan. And so I call this kind of like the runaway plot, right, where political leaders position themselves for the job of prime minister and minister of defense by being like increasingly military and wanting to subject occupied Palestinians to ever increasing forms of restriction and surveillance. Okay, and well, let me, I'm going to just come here to this next point, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So, that's sort of the story. This first half of Joshua really sets the political horizon for the state of Israel. But in my own research, that's not where I end. Instead, I go on to the second half of the book of Joshua, kind of asking, after the conquest is narrated, what is left? And what we see in this second half of the book of Joshua is really a kind of a tribal system where there are all kinds of smaller units of tribe, clan, and household. We also see the central role that female figures serve. Let me get to a map I want to show you, right? And if, we sit with the second half of the book of Joshua, which is really, about land, we see that there isn't a cohesive state of conquerors, but rather there's a patchwork of peoples, right? Peoples who overlap, who intermix, who have what we call in today's language, intersectional identities. And that, what the biblical narrative of Joshua is trying to do is like create unity among all of these different overlapping identities. And, my argument there is really in light of all of the violence against human communities, as well as the land itself, in light of all that violence that the Joshua narrative has caused in Israel and Palestine, might we look to this second half and recognize, right, how, as in ancient times, the modern location of Israel and Palestine is stratified, overlapping with all different kind of groups living in place. And so that's what I, really want to open up with the book and open up to our discussion here is, how do we think about this kind of overlapping affiliation, jurisdiction, sovereignty, and how do we think about kind of decentering the state, especially in situations of violence and occupation like we see in Israel, Palestine, and how might this second half of the book of Joshua serve as a template for the 21st century, just as the first half, the violent half of the book of Joshua, served as a template in the 20th century. So I'll end my remarks there, as well as my map, and look forward to our dialogue.
Thank you very much, Professor Avila, for that very interesting summary of the book. It's a pity we couldn't go through all your slides. We're hoping that we'll be able to hear a more comprehensive view of, your interpretation of the Joshua narrative and how it affects, the state of Israel. So without taking more time than necessary, I invite Dr. Fila to give our own discussion, to make our own discussion on the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, everyone. It's really good to be here. This is a kind of a different venue than I've spoken at in quite some time. And it's good to know that we are speaking in very kind of international context, not only the United States, not only West and Northern Africa, but also Rabbi Smith in London. So good. So I feel very cosmopolitan this morning, and I'm grateful to all of you for helping me feel that way. And of course to Rachel Haverlog for this great book. I should say that I'm not precisely a dispassionate discussant of this book. I really liked the book quite a lot. I've recommended it to a lot of people. And so I speak in a complimentary mode. I understand the book to be in some ways significantly subversive, and I'll talk about how exactly I see that happening. But what I actually want to focus on for some time, and what I want to begin by, is an observation that would on some level appear to be obvious, but which I think appears descriptively both to be not obvious and also very important, and it's this. This book, of course, is about the relationship between a biblical text, largely the book of Joshua, and its instantiation in modern Israeli politics. So the biblical modes or paradigms that make a certain kind of political Zionist conversation possible, and then also in some sense come to be imagined, the text comes to be imagined as a way in which the new state can better imagine itself as a unified entity. So most broadly, the book is about the relationship between the text and politics. But what is really important for me to know, and so I'll probably say this about 5 times, is that this is not an obvious relationship. And in fact, and now I'll put this out there is no obvious or self-evident relationship between any biblical text and any modern politics. That to make a claim about a relationship between a biblical text, any biblical text, and modern politics or ethics, any politics or ethics requires an interpretive move that focuses on some things and not others, or that centers some things and not others. And I really want to insist on this, if only because in my experience teaching both students and then in other adult or communal contexts, I actually find that this is one of the least self-evident things that both my students and adult learners consider. They imagine that in some sense the text has words and you read them, and that the words have a fairly self-evident connection, even if the connection is not clear, to some kind of modern politics or ethics. And I do not think this is true. So this is by way of beginning to say that the first thing I really like about this book is that I think it performs the fact that this relationship is not obvious, that there are texts, there are modern politics, the relationship between them is not clear. In fact, I mean, you can tell I feel strongly about this. It's not necessarily clear that that we even ought to try to attempt such a relationship. So I want to both insist on at least the possibility of severing the relationship between the biblical text and modern politics, and also to note that I think what the book does well is to continually perform the non-obviousness of modern politics that try to come out of the biblical text. Right, this is always an act of interpretation or an act of work. And Haberlock's book, for those who haven't yet begun to read, does this in a couple of ways. The first thing it does, and this was actually where I really thought the book was kind of fascinatingly subversive, is that the first couple of chapters are simply a very close reading of the book of Joshua. Now, it's a close reading that takes itself from various kinds of scholarly tools. So historical biblical analysis, literary analysis, various kind of critical theoretical approaches. So Haberlock doesn't assume, because of course this would be wrong, that she can just sort of read on her own and make the text come alive. But for a book that calls itself, whose subtitle is about Israeli occupation, right, about the Bible and the context of Israeli occupation, I actually thought that's really important to note that the first couple of chapters of the book are more simply about the book of Joshua read through various lenses. So I think this is important precisely because it doesn't even assume that we even know what Joshua says. It doesn't even assume that we know even the kind of strict trajectory of the first half of the book, the violent half, let alone the second half of the book of Joshua, where everyone who is said to be annihilated appears to sort of resurrect themselves in these various kind of contested communal formations. So the land, which was sort of bravely determined to be emptied early on in the book of Joshua, turns out to be sort of teeming with people and sort of geopolitical intrigues of various kinds and shifting alliances. So the land is still full of people. But I'll continue to focus on this, or I'll continue to kind of underscore this, because I think this is a really important contribution to how it is we think about the Bible at all. We don't know what it says, and to recommit ourselves to good reading before any kind of geopolitical reasoning, either descriptive or prescriptive, I think is an important philosophical and political claim. We don't know yet what the book says, so let's find out. Let's sit with the text for a while and read it. I understand this to be a kind of foundational philosophical practice. And then, having really sort of kind of induced the reader to sort of spend time in the book of Joshua, then Haberlock takes us into the second half of the book, which in some sense is first of all descriptive. There are people who understood themselves to be creating a kind of Joshua-inflected state. But here too, the importance of non-obvious interpretation is really central to how it is that the Ben-Gurion Study Group does its work. They construct a very particular group of people who will now sit around a very particular table, and not just any table and not just any home, but in the home of the first prime minister of this brand new and kind of fledgling state. And they're going to read the text very specifically. And this, of course, is not like the masses who are reading this. It's a very kind of carefully selected and curated group of men, both military strategists, that is to say early, people who were involved in what Israeli Jews would call the War of Independence, as well as historical scholars and archaeologists of the biblical text and biblical history. So this is already, even before we open the book in the context of the Ben Gurion study group, we already know, and Haberlach kind of makes us know, that it's a particular kind of table of people, and it could be different. They have a particular kind of significance, or a particular kind of goal that is set for them, and that influences not simply the way they read, but the kind of things about which they disagree. So we shouldn't imagine, and here the kind of considerations or significance of their debates becomes really important. We shouldn't imagine that even this curated group of people finds themselves in concert with one another. They dispute various kinds of things militarily, archaeologically, historically, and also discursively. How is it that a certain part of the biblical text should shape our conversation? They dispute these things, but their disputes are particular to them. So the fact of there being, for instance, military strategists in the room leads to a set of really fascinating sub-arguments during the study group about how it is that they should understand Joshua's military strategy. What kind of military strategy is this? And how might we be able to talk about Israeli military strategy in the language of biblical military strategy? Now, this is obviously, and again, I'll keep saying this because although I think in some sense it should become obvious, it's in my kind of experience, it's really not. It's not precisely clear what Joshua's military strategy is, even in the context of his own, of its text, let alone what Joshua's military strategy should mean for modern Israeli men disputing statecraft. So it's important that, as Rachel Haberlach said just a few minutes ago, Ben Gurion wanted a narrative. And to want a narrative means to read in a particular way. And what this means is that one of the most, a kind of subtle, but I think very acute contribution of the book is that she doesn't assume that there is any kind of natural relationship between the book of Joshua and the modern Israeli state. And once we see that, that is, as soon as we are kind of able to consider that possibility, then we have a very different lens through which to read the development of the state of Israel and the development of, among other things, and this is important, I think the public education system in the state of Israel, right? It becomes we begin to see what we would know to be obvious in other cases, which is that to construct public education, both within public schools and also public square education, means to make certain thoughts thinkable and other thoughts less thinkable. Right, so for certain ideas to be possible and other ideas to be less possible in the context of the Joshua text. So even to begin as a child learning Joshua as a kind of foundational biblical narrative represents itself a political choice, but the choice is as the non-natural nature of that choice is obscured by its sort of foundational nature for the Israeli state. And one way we might think about this in contrast is with the kind of traditional textual contribution in the Jewish liturgical year. So people might know, for instance, that in the kind of historical or traditional Jewish liturgical calendar, there is a bit of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which is chanted every week in the synagogue, and around which there are various events or study groups that sometimes take place depending on someone's community involvement. But that at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, wherein of course the Israelites stand sort of looking at the land that they're about to enter, God takes Moses up to a kind of like high mountain, and he says to him kind of very famously, this is the land which I have promised to you and your ancestors, but you will not enter it. And in this very kind of lonely narrative ending, the book of Deuteronomy ends. But in the synagogue, in the Jewish liturgical year, what happens at that moment? The chanter takes a deep breath and goes back to the beginning. So the first words of the Torah after the death of Moses, standing over this land which he will never enter, and which the Israelites are poised to enter, is of course to go back to Genesis, when in the beginning God began to create heaven and earth. So in the Jewish liturgical year, in this, the central kind of founding narrative of, let's say, of Israelite religion, the people never enter the land. The closest in the Jewish liturgical calendar that the people ever get is sort of poised on the edge of the land. And then all of a sudden, you and they and we sort of find ourselves back at the beginning of creation. Which is to say that to create a narrative of Jewish and Israeli history, which, as it were, begins with entering the land, is an important and notable thing to observe, because it is obviously a kind of innovation in what is important from the textual tradition and how we should understand ourselves in relation to that tradition. In the Jewish liturgical year, one never enters the land. In the Israeli public schools, one, as it were, enters the land as a child and never leaves. So I'll end where I began, which is just to say one more time that I think what is important about this book, what it performs really well, is that it kind of relentlessly, and I say that it really is a kind of relentless deconstruction of the idea that any particular relationship between the text in antiquity and the modern state is a constructed one. And this is important. When we say constructed, we don't mean that something is fake. What we do mean, I think, is that it's only real by a kind of social agreement. And that social agreement turns out to be much more precarious than Ben-Gurion hoped, or than one might observe. So I think the most important contribution of the book is this very particular sort of textual focus, which doesn't allow us to take for granted anything that we know about the text, and certainly anything that we know about the relationship between the text and modern politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phila, for this. I mean, we could sit down here all day and not get tired of listening to how you're dissecting the contents of this text. And if I could bring it home a bit to the Nigerian context, you know, this year in Nigeria specifically, we've been bedeviled with sorts of agitation from the different regions. So you have people from the Southwest and the Southeast specifically trying to say that, you know, let's renegotiate, you know, our agreement. So I'm from the Southwest, but without the accusation of being prejudiced, I would like to just, you know, discuss a bit about the Southeast and the foundations of their quest for agitation. We know that the quest for secession in the Southeast started in 1967, you know, which dovetailed to the Nigerian Civil War, just to give a very rough history, you know, not very concise, you know. But the thing is, if you Google the name of the figure of the Biafra agitation today, who is Nnamdi Kanu, you know, one of the many pictures you're going to see is with his skull cap and, you know, perhaps trying to appear as a rabbi, you know, to key into the narrative, which is centered on the return, you know, being in the diaspora and the quest for return, you know, back to the land, which Dr. Phila is telling us perhaps it's a constructed narrative, not in the sense of falsehood as she ended, but in terms of social agreements, which comes with its own complications. You know, this is, you know, very fascinating, you know, to relate this with our own context. So I'll go to the rabbi, you know, for him to give us his own expert view on the book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's starting to get dark already here in London. I want first to declare my interest. I've known Rachel for must be about 10 years now or so, and we were introduced by Professor Michael Berkowitz, who's a professor of modern history at modern Jewish history at University College London. And I was very impressed with Rachel's thinking and her writing. And this book here that she wrote about the River Jordan was very, very important, still is important. And on that basis, I plead guilty to recruiting Rachel to be on the International Advisory Committee of EcoPeace Middle East, which I am the co-chair of that committee. So I come here full of bias. So I want to, I suppose, amplify certain things in the Joshua generation through the lens of EcoPeace Middle East, as it were, and also my own academic research relating to the Holocaust, because I think when we discuss really anything about Israel, we can't leave out what happened just before. So EcoPeace Middle East is, and this is discussed a bit by Rachel in the Joshua generation, is a trilateral organization. There are offices in Ramallah in Palestine, in Amman in Jordan, and Tel Aviv in Israel. And there are two main thrusts, let's say, to the work. We could divide it into top-down stuff versus grassroots stuff. The top-down is about advocacy for sort of grand schemes, like the energy-water nexus. And this is an effort to create pragmatic, shared self-interest, and to bring that into the conflict. And because you can't expect people on different sides of a conflict that is so bitter and so long to, just start loving each other. So we start with shared self-interest and creating interdependencies. And one way that we've articulated it is for in Jordan is to try and I'm not a scientist here, but is to try in some way to capture, retain, and transport solar power from the deserts in Jordan to Israel and to trade that for desalinated water. So at present, Israel is using fossil fuels to power the desal. Incidentally, they're like the leading desalinators in the world, both in terms of efficiency, quote unquote, and in terms of quantities. And to base that on solar power through Jordan. And then our aim is that the Palestinians would get their fair share of that water. And this especially applies to Gaza, which I'll come to in a moment, that Rachel takes this leap. In a way, it's a leap, but it's also kind of an act of genius to bring in Gaza into the Joshua generation. So Rachel's no stranger to water. And that's also made clear in this book here, where in part of it, in Rachel's exegesis, the River Jordan is not merely a border. In fact, it's more of a place of character transformation, let's say, or ethnic crossing than actually a fixed border. as is usually assumed. It's a place of crossing rather than of division. And it's also a place for the marginalized to be transformed as they cross. And Rachel uses the example of Ruth, who's the Moabitess. You know, the Moabitess women were deemed to be trouble because, you know, they lure nice Jewish boys, as it were, into trouble, into illicit relationships, you know, marrying out. But, and so Ruth is cast as this nicey nice who converts to being a Hebrew, being a Jew, as it were. But that's only part of the story. She actually extends through determination and very skillful negotiation on so many levels to find a way into what for her is an alien society and to make her place. And she's not someone who simply submits to a dominant culture. And this is really key. And that crossing this river in a way symbolizes this transformation of status. And this is really, really important. So the gender dimension of borders, let's say, as Rachel does. The other thing I wanted to say, and Rachel goes into this, is the grassroots. It's interesting concentrating on the character of Ruth. You know, this is a grassroots household situation. So the grassroots work of EcoPeace is about creating localized relationships. They're localized, but they're also cross-border. And again, we have this idea of shared self-interest. You know, pollution doesn't respect borders. And so the sewage and the slime that's so much of the Jordan River, it doesn't stay on one side, it goes from one to the other. And so you get local politicians, mayors of small villages, kids, teachers, cross-border, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli. And our flagship program is called Good Water Neighbors, and we make linkages that start off with this shared self-interest, and trust is built. And I've personally witnessed a great deal of this work. It's absolutely amazing. So the kids and the teachers and the field workers of EcoPeace have this idea of citizenship of a region, of a geographical region, and not merely as being citizens of a nation or a tribe or something like that. And this is really around the Jordan Valley. And we've created sort of master plans for growing the economy, but based on initiatives that are about restoring, rehabilitating the river and the ruined environment of that area. Okay, so there's one other thing here I wanted to bring out from Rachel's previous book. Yeah, and that was just to emphasize the point, is that the Jordan River is not about a dividing line. And so here we see the trajectory for Rachel's thinking about the book of Joshua, which very much comes out of the mythology concerning the Jordan River. Just check my notes here. Okay, so bringing in Gaza in a way quite suddenly to the Joshua generation. And today, Gaza is termed really the worst part. In fact, it is the very worst part of what would be considered the occupation of the land, the military occupation by Israel. And in terms of the environment, nearly 100% of the water in Gaza is not drinkable. And the aquifer is collapsed and it's being filled by brackish water from the Mediterranean and raw sewage. It is a horrible, horrible situation. The incidence of gastric and disease and cancer, kidney cancer, is out of all proportion. And so how do we try at EcoPeace, in a sense, to sell a solution to the Israeli government, which is really not that interested in the people of Gaza? They don't care. So how do we do that? So we try and transform, in a sense, the terms of the conflict to say, look, you Israelis, it's in your security interest for the Gazans to have water security and sanitation and hygiene. Now here we're treading a very fine line. I'm going to be very honest. We at EcoPeace are accused by many on the Palestinian side of being normalizers, that we're normalizing the occupation. And the Jews that are involved in EcoPeace are accused of being anti-Semites or self-hating Jews by the Israeli side. We're walking a tightrope. So what is going on here is we're trying to find ways in all three offices of playing, manipulating, getting under the surface of each of the three governments, because they're all about their own power structures and their own status quo. And as Rachel goes so much into and so effectively, the big businesses and the entrepreneurs that control large aspects of the water issues, and even what are perceived as the solutions that we're actually backing. So what we're trying to do is actually, although it's largely humanitarian, it's extremely complicated and at times paradoxical and contradictory. Now, but it's based on the idea that no system, occupation, no system is monolithic. And we have to play with that system. And we get one part of the Israeli government to sue another part of the government, get what we want in terms of environmental solutions, and also in terms of not building a section, say, of the wall in certain places. So this comes back to my research about the Holocaust, and there's a linkage here. And I think what Rachel is trying to argue for at the very end of her book is, in terms of solutions, that they're very tentative, and it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It is immensely complicated, the stuff. It's not black and white. And my own research is about a liberal left entrepreneur in Nazi Germany, who on the one hand is saving Jewish people and leftists and marginalized people all the way from 33 to 45 through the whole thing. So this is not a Schindler, a fly-by-night character like a Schindler. So he's doing this however he can and helping people who are being persecuted in ways that are utterly relevant and helpful, but also respect the empoweredness of the people he's trying to help, because they have something to give too. So this is not merely rescuer and victim, which is another thing we have to think about in terms of the conflict and our role. But he has relations with certain people in the Nazi regime, and he's able to use those relations to gain leverage in order to help people. And it gets even more complicated because he makes munitions, and he makes munitions that nobody else makes. And the Nazis are desperate for this stuff. And they know full well what he's doing against their own interests and their own values. Okay. But he is able to manipulate the system. I mean, he is unbelievably stressed. He has a stroke, he had a nervous breakdown. His daughter is arrested and almost dies. Okay. But he walks a tightrope. And I'm not drawing an analogy between Nazi Germany and Israel, but just to say that no system is monolithic. And sometimes the way to resist, to create pathways for solutions, is not straightforward. And there's a lot of gray area. And my role, my research is not about making a judgment. It's simply about acknowledging the strangeness of it all and the contradictions as richly as I can. So I also want to add, just before I close, that the Nazis saw themselves as victims. They were the ultimate victims. And that their work in exterminating and oppressing and wanting empire, they saw that in terms of their own survival. Now, I'm not equating Nazi Germany and the Israeli occupation, but there's a long scale of which Nazism, let's say, is an extreme. But somewhere in that Israeli need to have myth and to be strong and to oppress, there's an inner core of being a victim. And victims turn to being abusers. Now, this is all very psychoanalytic and all the rest of it. But here we have a victim people, as it were, being dumped on another people who are victims too. Europe and America wanting to wash their hands of the Jewish problem and all those displaced people at the end of World War II, creating Israel in the United Nations. And the West has a lot to answer. And then Rachel ends her book with a note of hope, cautious hope, in terms of certain initiatives based around water. I would add to that, as I've tried to, this idea of creating some shared self-interest. And then maybe there can be pockets of trust that can grow, but it's very tentative stuff. Very tentative, very, 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 very complex when you have the protagonist in the conflict both seeing their very survival at stake. Of course, even though one has a lot more power than the other. But as depressing as it sounds, we just keep chipping away, little by little by little, fully aware of the ambivalences, the ambiguities, the contradictions, and it's one small step at a time. So I want to thank Rachel for another brilliant book, and for trying to get to really understand the mythologies, and to acknowledge that there is a huge problem that may be unsolvable, probably is unsolvable in our lifetime, but we have to keep chipping away anyway, however tentative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Frank, for this very fresh, practical perspective of Rachel's book, which is, something that breathes fresh air. And I love your notes of ending, the note on which you ended, the Holocaust context, where you brought in a very important perspective of powerlessness as a form of power in itself, So people key into the narratives of victimhood, and they perpetrate atrocities. And it's also a fine line when you look at it in terms of who. So this is one of the problems of transitional justice in itself, if you relate this to the work of the center, to say when and where do you draw the lines between who a victim is in the actual sense of the word and who a perpetrator is, at what point, you know. And you have a case of child soldiers abducted, you know, early, and they joined the militias, you know. You have the people who were forcefully conscripted, and you talk about amnesties and taking care of these people. You know, in Nigeria, there's a very controversial intervention that they call Operation Safe Corridor, which in itself is a military initiative, you know, of trying to like give soft landing for people that were affiliated with the insurgents, as they call them, you know, but not willfully, according to them. So they profile these kind of people and they keep them in camps and they try to reinsert them back into the communities. But this has caused a lot of controversy because the victims are saying that you abandon us for these new victims, if you could, you know, call them that. You know, so it's always interesting to see the power dynamics and how people tend to play, even in terms of identity, you know, of being who, at what point in time, and to what end. You know, this is also very important. The other thing I wanted to mention is the work of EcoPeace, which I must comment as something that is very important when you look at the management of tense perennial conflict situations and the challenge of how you're perceived by either side of the divide, you know, where your own people, for instance, see you as betraying them, while others see you as, you know, in the opposition, and how you have to constantly keep managing this. I just remember an experience I had earlier in the week where we were trying to work on a document for the African Union with case studies from, you know, some other parts. And some people, let me just for brevity, just to say that some case studies didn't go well with some people from particular states who claimed that okay, sorry, I think I went off for a bit, but I'll just hand over the floor to Professor Avelo to continue. Sorry, yeah, thank you. So, you can respond. Do you have any response to the discussions? Yeah.
Should I begin there, Philip?
Yes, please.
Okay, and should I respond to the questions that were posed so far in the chat? I guess I will.
Yeah, that will save us some time as well, because we're running out of time, I think.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I see from the Infinix note 7 about the significance of Joshua's text to contemporary times when global peace is a dominant discourse and necessity. And if I may, I'm messing around a little bit, I'd like to share the screen again and introduce a figure that I think helps us, I think it speaks to the wonderful commentary that Emily provided about, you know, that how no interpretation is automatic or somehow immediately relevant to politics. And I think also speaks to Rabbi Frank's discussion of water. And I want to introduce you here. Maybe some of you know her. There are only 2 women in the whole book of Joshua. And it's not surprising. It's a book about an army. It is a book that really conflates nationalism with an army, as well as with a kind of constructed form of masculinity. And there's a scene after the battles have ended. And it's, again, one of these two scenes with a female character. And again, we are introduced to this figure, Achsa, a Kenizzite of Judah, which is, again, a kind of an attribution that shows these overlapping identities. Again, the word we use in modern times is intersectional, how gender and ethnicity and religion and class position, right? How all these things, kind of overlap to inform our subjectivity and our sense of agency. And so Achsa is a Kenizzite of Judah. So I think we see right away, right? Judah is kind of this premier tribe of ancient Israel, right? Kind of the foundation of, the whole idea of being Judean and ultimately being Jewish, but she's a Kenizzite of Judah. So we see right away this kind of premier tribe is made up, right, of this composite form of many different groups who actually live in the region. And Achsa's father wants some land conquered. And he says, whatever kinsman of mine who goes and conquers this land, you can marry my daughter. So this conquest happens. Achsa is given away. We think it's an occasion of a woman being passed off from her father to a husband. And then Achsa speaks up in the book, and she says to her father, right, you've given me away as desert land, now give me springs of water. And it's a very small passage. I think, there's a lot more background behind it that we don't have present in the text. But what's really interesting is that Achsa, renegotiates this whole transference between father and husband. And right, she kind of, negotiates, if you will, kind of the first peace treaty, right? If Joshua is this foundational text of conquest, then it's left to this non-military female character to really address what it takes to inhabit the land. And I take very seriously this other, designation that Achsa is a Kenizzite of Judah, because, right, this is exactly the way in which this family, marked as somehow ethnically different, they're Kenizzites, right? It is through this act of water sharing that they become an integral clan in the tribe of Judah. So, if we're talking about what, this book of Joshua might have to do, in contemporary times when we're talking about global peace, I mean, of course, one answer is the answer of, rabbis from other centuries, like glue it shut, right? Don't read about a kind of a context that understands political relationships in terms of military dominance and submission. So on the one hand, like throw it away. But if we're not going to throw it away, then I think, the secret really rests in this second half, and really rests in the example that I take in particular, right? Achsa is my big hero, right? Because how does this woman really think about the exigencies of inhabiting space? And right, when it comes down to it, and this is why, as both Emily and Frank have noticed, right, the book at the end takes a big jump to contemporary Gaza, which is the world's worst water crisis. And I use that as a kind of a thought exercise to think, what can we do? If we're going, I don't care if anyone never reads Joshua again. Honestly, it wouldn't bother me. But, right, if we are operating in this interpretive paradigm, then I think it's precisely what Achsa tells us, which is a kind of a watershed politics, right? We all, I think all of us are here on this this call right now, right? Because of the political crisis of, nationalism to some degree, compounded by contemporary climate change, which is even more punishing to marginalized groups. So here we are, right, with different power dynamics among people living in the same place. And it's this watershed politics that, that I think shows the way towards reconciliation through inhabitants, because we all have to draw from these existing sources of water that are in crisis, just as our political systems are. They're in crisis. Again, I don't think I need to say this, to people on a call from Nigeria, through extraction, through pollution, right, through corporate and oligarchic claims of natural resources in places, right? But how do we think about something that Frank said, right? Negotiating under these political realities so that we can protect existing sources of water, so that we can redistribute them in ways that reflect some kind of justice, but also enable inhabitation. And I think thinking of ourselves, right, as shared drawers from a common source of water might be the most powerful way to move forward, in highly stratified, violent times when, water in, many parts of the world is already privatized, whether by corporations, and, there's only about 4 of them that operate globally. So wherever we're coming from today, they are familiar names, and in many cases, water's been privatized by its pollution, but in many traditional cultures and in some remaining legal systems, this is still something public that we share also, not only with each other, but also with non-human species. So like Ahsa for me is that way forward, right? We navigate and we negotiate the right to protect water, to draw from it and share it with others. And I think this gives us a different way of thinking about our own positions and, hopefully builds up what Frank was saying about that shared interest. So that is an answer to that. And then there was another excellent question. I think I hope Philip maybe jumps in. This is from Francis, asking about Igbo as Hebrews and what could the book of Joshua do. So I'm gonna bring Philip up into this question a little bit, but I would say one thing about it. I would say that the failure of the conquest model is already there in the narrative of conquest. As Emily said, this whole first part of the chapter, I go really carefully through the conquest narrative, to show that its inherent failure is right there. And I do the same thing with Ben-Gurion's narrative of conquest, because the failure is already there because, even after the War of 1948 or the War of 1967, Palestinians never disappeared. And so, you can make all the narratives of exclusion, of pushing this group that is inconvenient to your own political aspirations, pushing them out of the narrative, but they're still there in space. And so that's why this conquest model in its modern instantiation is such a failure, because it didn't teach anybody how to live in space, right? It instead of teaching people how to live in space and, distribute resources and figure out that shared future, it just necessitated the endless pushing out of Palestinians, and that began in narrative, expanded to the legal system, the educational system, exclusion from economic opportunity, and gets to absurd things like an actual, wall. but the wall is absurd because, capital and labor cross that wall all the time. So it's like this horrid, like concrete, electric and electronic version of trying to exclude people who are there. And so like, this is not going to work, right? Like you cannot, think that your imaginative exclusion can create geographic reality. So, the ancient and the modern conquest narrative are like total failures that put everyone involved on more precarious ground. And, just like precludes the necessary work. It is not, in no place in time is it easy to live alongside others. I'm coming to you from the city of Chicago that has an invisible line right through it of north and south. And that is a black and white line, and we have, are far from perfecting it, even with our abundance of water. But that's the work, right? This co-inhabitation thing that is all the more vital in climate change. So again, I want Philip and others to speak to the Nigerian context because I'm a student here of that. But I would say, right, any reclamation of historical territory, always has to encompass those contemporary realities, alongside what might be, a quite justified call for sovereignty, simply because one's call for sovereignty is justified, doesn't mean that you don't have to do that work of how do you end up, reconciling the sharing of space and resources with other groups there. And Philip, I'm going to pass that one back to you.
Okay, so let me say that we know that we cannot exhaust the discussion on this in an hour and a half. So this is like an appetizer. We're planning a robust roundtable for March, where we're going to bring in experts, to help us, dissect the context of how we can relate the Middle East, a bit on the Biafra War, or the question of identity generally. This divide when it comes to identity is either it's primordial, where people claim to be autochthonous, Some claim that they grew from the ground, and all of us have narratives of stories of origin of our different ethnicities, and the constructed ones, which it's, more utilitarian in perspective, and which Emily told us, as a matter of fact, that this has to do with social arrangement, put them that way. And so it's important that we go beyond the narrative of reclamation or conquest or stuff to the ideals that are being projected by groups like EcoPeace, for instance, to say, how do we reach middle ground? Instead of fighting, instead of going all out to appropriate things to ourselves, how do we share? How do we make the world a better place? Because this is the only way in which we can, move forward as a people, Other than being nationalists, how can we be truly citizens within the same geopolitical space? I think this is what is important when we talk about questions of ethnic identities and marginalization. So I think there's a question for Emily. We'll almost have like 4 minutes. I hope she will be able to address it in those 4 minutes. And maybe a last word from the rabbi as well, yeah.
So I'm seeing a general question about the purpose of the Bible apart from ethics and politics. And I think this is actually a really important question that I both want to clarify and talk about at great length, but we'll talk about in 3.5 minutes instead. To be clear, I want to be clear that I am not inherently opposed to drawing ethical or political relationships or conclusions from or from within the biblical text. But I am, and I will take a relatively strong position, I am very skeptical that this can be done consistently, and certainly that it can be done in a way that sufficiently naturalizes the conclusion for it to be useful. So I'll give an example from my own work, which is not unrelated. I've been writing a bit about the, and by a bit I mean like 5 articles about the Exodus. One thing, of course, I've encountered is the narrative of the Exodus, this kind of massive liberation of the Israelite people from Egyptian slavery in Pharaoh. And this, of course, becomes a kind of very fundamental trope in Christian liberation theology, particularly in the Latin and South American context, and then also to some degree in the United States. And in the in Western and Central African context as well. But there's been a kind of interesting pushback in the last generation against using this trope as a trope of liberation, because of course the same Israelites who are liberated from slavery with absolutely nothing, who kind of wander into the wilderness, for whom God has a great preference, become the conquerors. In a generation and a half, the Western representative of beleaguered nationhood becomes, of course, the people of the first half of Joshua, which is maybe a kind of oblique but maybe kind of suggestive way of saying that I do tend to think that the biblical text really resists our it resists our attempts to consistently make it work for us. And so whatever that means, and some people might take a kind of more gentle position, whereas I'm feeling very declarative today. Whatever that means, it does mean that we're consistently in a kind of uncertain position vis-a-vis the ethical character of the text in any direct way. So I'd sort of say for now, and this is what I really liked about Rachel's book, was that it's actually better to kind of see where we can be surprised by the text. Where is it that we thought the text is kind of different than we thought it was, for better or for worse, where the text kind of surprises us in a certain way, or, we never noticed these 3 verses and all of a sudden they come to seem very important, or we never noticed this sort of like random woman in the book of Joshua, and now here she is, for possibly providing some kind of meaningful paradigm for a conflict of gross and asymmetrical injustice. I want to make a kind of argument for the kind of persistence of the biblical text and its ability to surprise us ethically and politically, but less for its ability to kind of very carefully or consistently guide us as we might expect. I think that's what I think about that for now.
Yeah, one last word from Rabbi Frank?
Yes, I very much agree with what Emily has just said. I think one of the things I also admire about the text is that it portrays things warts and all. Those people going through the desert, fleeing from slavery, or what we call slavery, we don't know exactly what it was, towards some sort of vision, some sort of promised place or state of mind. I mean, they behave horribly. It's their warts and all. Half the time they want to go back because the food tasted better. And they conspire against Moses, and I mean, they're horrible. And they drive Moses to distraction. And ultimately what defeats him is when he strikes the rock and claims the miracle of the water. Oh, we're back to water. The water gushing out. It's just, it's like he makes out in a way that it's his miracle and not that of God's. Here's a struggling politician fighting for his political and individual life against these stressed out people that he's totally stuck with. And I do agree with what Emily said, is we need to keep combing things for the little bits that don't quite fit, is how we might sort of stereotypically view the text. And there are odd little things here and there, and there are contradictions. Another way to look at it is just in terms of its, let's say, literary structure, in terms of the forms. If we look at the creation story, for example, and the phrase and the incidence of the phrases, and it was so and it was good, if we look at it very carefully, we see that human beings get neither. We're not fixed or known, and we ain't necessarily good. We have an anomalous, peculiar place in all of creation. I mean, and you know, we dismiss or revere the creation story for all sorts of reasons, many of which are dubious. But if we look at the actual construction of the thing, poetically, let's say, or the rhythms or the incidences of certain words, where they are, where they aren't, and we cross-examine in a way, we come upon mysteries or anomalies that are really important, and not just sort of prescriptions. So the text can raise questions about the strangeness of things. And I suppose that's what interests me most of all, is just the strange.
Thank you very much, everyone, for a very interesting topic. Sorry for taking more of your time, but just to mention that, like I earlier said, we'll be back in March on this same topic to engage in more robust, discussion on how we can interpret the context, in Israel with our own situation in Africa and other parts of the world. So thank you for your patience. Thank you to the author, Professor Avila. Thank you to Dr. Fila. Thank you, Rabbi Smith, for taking time to honor our invitation and for your for sharing your wealth of experience and scholarship with us. We've really benefited a lot from it, and hope that you always join us subsequently when we beckon on you for our events. So we'll be back in January with our Distinguished Personality Lecture Series, and we promise you a very interesting time as well. Thank you very much, and all the very best for the rest of the day, wherever you are in the part of the world. So thank you. We had our performance earlier, so for those that came late, you have to go and catch up, on the video on our website. So bye, everyone.